The mediator hadn't even finished reading the opening statement when Derek leaned over to his lawyer and whispered something. His lawyer smiled. That kind of smile that tells you the other person thinks this is already over. I kept my hands flat on the table. I didn't look at Derek. I'd stopped looking at him the way I used to, searching his face for the person I married, somewhere around year 4 of our marriage. By year 11, I had learned that the face you fall in love with and the face that looks back at you across a mediation table are sometimes worn by the same man, and that is the strangest grief of all. His lawyer, a man named Forsythe, had a stack of documents in front of him, very organized, very confident. He had the posture of someone who had already decided how the afternoon would go. I had a manila envelope, just one. I should tell you who I was before I tell you what happened in that room. My name is Miriam. I am 51 years old. I grew up in Guelph, Ontario, in a house that smelled like my mother's cooking and my father's woodworking projects. My father was a quiet man. He taught me that the most important things you do in life are usually the ones nobody sees. He said that to me when I was 12, while he was sanding the underside of a chair that would sit in a corner and never be noticed. I thought about that a lot in the years that followed. I became a forensic accountant. I know, not exactly what people imagine when they picture a dramatic career. No uniform, no courtroom scenes on television, no one ever made a Netflix series called The Forensic Accountant. What I did was follow money. I found where it went when people tried to make it disappear. For 22 years I worked as a senior investigator contracted through the federal government, first with the Canada Revenue Agency's Criminal Investigations Program, and later as a specialist brought in on cases involving financial fraud, money laundering, and organized crime. I held security clearance at a level I am not going to specify here, because some things you carry quietly and that's simply how it is. When Derek and I met, I told him I worked in financial compliance. That was true. It was also incomplete. He never pushed for more, and I was grateful for that at the time. You spend years in a world where you choose every word carefully, and you bring that habit home with you. It becomes part of how you breathe. We met at a dinner party in Toronto. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, effortlessly, and with complete awareness of the effect. He ran a mid-sized commercial real estate firm. He liked good wine, ski weekends in Tremblant, and telling stories at dinner parties that always ended with him at the center of them. I was 39. I thought I had waited long enough to know the difference between a good story and a good man. I was wrong about that. The first time I realized something was off, we had been married about 8 months. We were at a dinner with 2 of his colleagues and their wives. Derek was in the middle of a story about a deal he'd closed. The way he told it, the whole thing hinged on his instinct, his nerve, his phone call at exactly the right moment. It was a good story, probably mostly true. Then one of the wives, a warm woman named Beverly, turned to me and asked what I did. Before I could answer, Derek said, "Miriam does government paperwork. Very dry stuff, you'd fall asleep in 5 minutes." He laughed. Everyone smiled politely. I looked at him. He was already moving on to the next part of his story. I told myself it was nothing. He didn't fully understand what I did. That was fair. I'd never given him the whole picture. I told myself he wasn't trying to diminish me. He was just filling a pause. But it happened again. And again. And each time it was a little more specific. She counts numbers for the government. She does filing. Important filing. Wink to the room. You know how it is. Somebody has to make sure the paperwork gets done. At a family Christmas dinner 2 years into our marriage, his mother asked me about my work. Derek answered for me. She's basically a government accountant. Very stable job. Good pension. And then he pivoted the conversation to something else before I had drawn a breath. I looked across the table at my sister-in-law, who had met me once before at the wedding and knew nothing about me, and I watched her absorb this information with a small nod. Oh. Okay, a government accountant. And that was who I became, in that room, in that family at that table. I didn't correct him. Not that night. I have thought about that choice many times since. I think I stayed quiet because there was a part of me that was trained, professionally, deeply, to protect information, and another part that simply did not want to make a scene at Christmas dinner. But silence, I have learned, is only neutral for a moment. After that, it becomes agreement. I need to tell you about the Hargrove file, because it matters later. In 2019, I led a 3-year investigation into a network of shell companies that had been used to launder approximately $47 million through real estate transactions in British Columbia and Ontario. The case involved 11 individuals, 3 criminal organizations, and coordination with the RCMP and 2 provincial financial regulators. I cannot tell you everything about it. Some of it remains sealed. What I can tell you is that when the case concluded in early 2022, there were 8 convictions, and that a letter was placed in my personnel file from the Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP, commending the work of our team and noting, specifically, the methodology I had developed for tracing layered asset transfers. A methodology that is now standard procedure. I was given a commendation. Quiet ceremony, small room, the kind of recognition that doesn't appear in press releases. Derek was at a ski weekend in Collingwood that day. I hadn't told him the ceremony was happening, not because I was hiding it, though I see how it might look that way now. Mostly because explaining it would have required explaining everything, and I had been explaining things in pieces for so long that starting over felt exhausting. Our marriage was already cracking by then. Not loudly. It was the quiet kind of deterioration. Missed dinners, conversations that ended before they started, the particular loneliness of lying beside someone who has no real idea who you are, and who has stopped being curious enough to find out. In March of 2023, I told Derek I wanted a separation. He looked at me across the kitchen island and said, "You've been unhappy." Not a question. A statement delivered with the mildness of a man who has already processed something you thought you were surprising him with. "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. "We'll figure out the finances." And that, the finances, was where things became something else entirely. Derek's lawyer Forsythe had a theory. The theory was that Derek had been the primary earner in our marriage, that my government salary, while steady, had been modest. That Derek's real estate business had generated the significant wealth, the house in the annex, the cottage in Muskoka, the investment accounts. That in the course of an 11-year marriage with no children, the equalization payment should reflect the disparity in contributions. On paper, it was not an insane argument. My paychecks looked exactly the way Derek had always described them to his family. Government salary, stable, unremarkable. What Forsythe did not know, could not have known, was that government salary was not my only income. Over 22 years I had been retained as a specialist consultant on 41 separate engagements, federal and provincial, some short, some lasting years. Each billed at a rate that reflected the specificity of my expertise. I had also, in 2018, co-authored a technical framework for cross-jurisdictional asset tracing that was licensed to 3 regulatory bodies and had generated ongoing royalty payments that went into a separate professional account. None of this was hidden. It was all declared, all taxed, all on paper somewhere. But it was not in the documents Derek's side had pulled because they had looked at exactly what they expected to find, which was a government accountant with a government salary. And they had stopped looking there. I knew they had stopped looking because I know how people look for money, and I know what they skip when they think they already have the answer. So when Forsythe laid out their proposal, a number that represented Derek's calculation of what I was owed after 11 years, I listened to the whole thing. I didn't interrupt. I didn't change my expression. Derek caught my eye once across the table. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that said, "Just take it and we can all go home." I turned to my lawyer, a woman named Constance, who had been sitting quietly with her own folder and a very particular kind of patience. I said, "I'd like to respond now." Constance slid the first document across the table. It was a summary sheet. 11 pages, but the summary was on top. She had organized it the way I had organized it, because I had given her the structure. Forsythe picked it up. He read the first page. He put it down. He picked it up again. I watched his eyes move. I have spent years watching people process numbers. There is a specific expression that appears when someone realizes the landscape they thought they were standing on is not the landscape that exists. It isn't panic. It isn't even surprise. Exactly. It's a kind of recalibration. A slight stillness before the adjustment begins. Forsythe had that expression. Derek was watching him. "What is it?" Forsythe didn't answer immediately. He turned to page 3, which was the summary of the consultancy billings. Then to page 7, which was the licensing income. Then to page 9, which was the commendation letter, and the attached documentation of the Hargrove case. Not the case details, which were protected, but the scope of the role, the level of clearance, the public record of outcome. Derek leaned over and looked at the page Forsythe was on. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "What is all this?" I said, "My career." He stared at me. Not the way people stare when they're angry, not even the way they stare when they're surprised. It was the stare of someone rearranging furniture in a room they thought they knew completely, and discovering that the back wall is not where they believed it to be. "You did this?" he said. The "this" encompassed the document, the number on page 1, the commendation, possibly the last 11 years. "I've been doing this since before I met you," I said. Forsythe asked if we could take a 10-minute recess. His voice had changed, not dramatically, but I heard it. Constance said that would be fine. Derek stood up from the table. He walked to the window of the mediator's office. We were on the 14th floor on Bay Street, the city spread out gray and November below us. And he stood there with his hands in his pockets. I did not look at him with satisfaction. I want to be clear about that. I have been asked since by friends who knew the story whether it felt good, and I understand why they ask. But the honest answer is no, not in the way they mean. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion completing itself. The particular tiredness of a thing that has been half-finished for a long time finally arriving at its end. I looked at the table instead. At the summary sheet still in Forsythe's hand. I thought about my father sanding the underside of a chair. There is something I have to explain about the years when Derek was telling people I counted numbers for the government. I let it happen. That is true. And I have sat with the reasons for long enough to be honest about them. Part of it was professional. The nature of my work required discretion. I was genuinely not allowed to discuss much of what I did. When Derek filled in the blanks with something small and harmless, there was a part of my brain that simply registered that works and moved on. But there was another part, a part I'm less comfortable with. I think I wanted to see whether he would ever ask. Whether, after a year of marriage, or 2 or 5, he would sit down one evening and say, "Miriam, I don't really understand what you do. Can you help me understand?" I think I was waiting for the question, and it never came, not because he forgot to ask. Because he had already decided he knew the answer, and the answer was small and the answer was convenient, and the answer let him remain the most interesting person in every room we entered together. I don't say this to be cruel to him now. I think Derek genuinely believed he was a good husband. I think he would tell you if you asked him that he was supportive and present, and that I was simply a private person who didn't share much. He would not be entirely wrong. But there is a version of not asking that isn't about respecting privacy. It's about not wanting to know an answer that complicates the picture you've already framed. I had been living inside his frame for 11 years. When Forsythe read page 3 of that summary, I watched the frame fall. The recess lasted 22 minutes. I know because I timed it. When Forsythe came back, his posture was different, still professional. But the certainty was gone. He was doing the thing lawyers do when the case they walked in with is no longer the case they have, which is recalibrate without showing that they're recalibrating. He asked Constance whether we would be open to revisiting the proposed structure. Constance said we would be pleased to discuss an equitable arrangement, yes. What followed was 2 hours of negotiation that I will not walk you through in detail, because the specifics are part of a private agreement. What I will tell you is that the number we left with was not the number Derek's side had proposed when they walked in. It was not even close. Derek signed. He signed without looking at me. His pen moved across the page with the flatness of a man who has understood something about himself that he does not yet know how to hold. I signed after him. Constance put the documents in her folder. The mediator thanked everyone for their time with the particular neutrality of a person whose job requires them to have no feelings about outcomes. We rode down in the elevator separately. I took the stairs to the lobby so I wouldn't have to. 3 months later, my friend Yvonne, who had known me since our early years in the CRA, who had been at my wedding and had not said "I told you so" even once, which is the mark of a truly good friend, took me out to dinner at a small restaurant in Kensington Market. We ordered wine, the good kind. She raised her glass. To the underside of the chair, she said. I had told her about my father. She had remembered. We drank. "Do you think he knew?" she asked. "Derek, do you think some part of him always knew he was wrong about you and just chose not to look?" I turned the question over. It's the kind of question that doesn't have one answer, just a set of slightly different truths depending on the angle. "I think," I said finally, "that it's very easy to believe the story that's convenient, and very hard to love someone enough to keep asking who they actually are." Yvonne nodded. She looked at her wine. "Well," she said, "he lost a forensic accountant with federal clearance and a licensing deal." She paused. "I hope the real estate is treating him well." I laughed. Genuinely, for the first time in what felt like months. Outside, the November street was cold and loud. Streetcar going by, someone's dog barking at nothing, the city doing what it always does. Moving without asking anyone's permission. I pulled on my coat. I am not going to tell you that everything since has been simple. It hasn't. Divorce at 51 means rebuilding things you didn't expect to rebuild. The Muskoka cottage, which I had loved, genuinely, the way you love a place that holds 10 years of summer mornings, was sold as part of the settlement. I have a condo now on the west end of the city, 2 floors up, with a window that faces east and catches the morning light in a way that I like more than I expected to. I still work. Not at the same pace as before. I chose to step back from federal contracts after the separation, partly for practical reasons and partly because I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, and I recognize that tiredness as a signal worth listening to. I consult now on a smaller scale. Private firms' compliance reviews, the occasional provincial engagement. Enough to be useful, enough to be interested. My father's chair is in my living room. I brought it from the house in the annex. Derek hadn't noticed it or hadn't cared, and it came with me without anyone remarking on it. It sits in the corner, near the window, and most mornings I have my coffee in it, and I think about what it means to do good work in a way that nobody sees. I think it means the work still happened. I think it means the underside of the chair is still smooth. A few weeks ago I ran into Beverly. The woman from that dinner party, years ago, the one who had asked me what I did before Derek answered for me. We were at the same fundraiser for a legal aid organization downtown. She recognized me first. We stood with our drinks and caught up the way you do with someone who exists at the edge of your life. She asked how I was doing. I told her honestly. The separation, the condo, the shift in work. She listened in the way that some people do, with their full attention. Then she said, I always thought there was more to you than he let on. I looked at her. I'm sorry, she added quickly. That's an odd thing to say. No, I said, it isn't. She smiled. What do you actually do? You never got to answer, so I told her, not everything. But enough, the broad shape of it, the 22 years, the type of work, the level of it. I watched her face as I spoke. She was quiet when I finished. My God, she said softly. I shrugged it a little. It was always there. People just didn't ask. She laughed, slightly incredulous, the way people do when they realize they've been eating in a restaurant for years without looking at the whole menu. We exchanged numbers. We've had lunch twice since then. I don't tell this story to make Derek into a villain. I have thought carefully about that. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who decided early and without much examination that he was the main character in our shared life, and organized everything around that conclusion. It is a common error. It causes enormous damage. And it can be done without any malice at all, which is perhaps the strangest thing about it. What I know is this: I spent 11 years allowing someone else to narrate who I was. I let it happen in small increments. A dinner party, a Christmas table, a conversation I didn't enter. I told myself it was discretion, or privacy, or not wanting to make a scene. And then I walked into a mediation room on a Tuesday in November, and I put a summary sheet on the table, and I let the numbers speak for themselves. They were very loud. Derek's lawyer asked to take a recess. And I sat there quietly, and I waited. Not because I needed to see him surprised. Not because I wanted him diminished. But because for the first time in 11 years, the full weight of who I actually was had been placed on the table where we were both sitting, and it turned out that weight had been there all along. I had simply been the only one carrying it.